Dear colleagues, my name is Isaac Frumin, and I'm a head of Institute of Education of High School of Economics. And on behalf of the Observatory on Higher Education Transformations, I'm glad to welcome you to our first open expert discussions that we'll have regularly to talk with the leading experts in the field of higher education studies and maybe other fields to discuss the emerging trends of higher education. As today we have the first expert session, I like to follow the Russian tradition to give you a short piece of music which is playing when the boat departing the port. So it's just a few seconds. It's called Farewell of Slavic Woman. Okay, so with this music, we can be sure that we'll succeed in our endeavor. I would remind you again about a very important technical moment that we have to, those of us who are not speaking at that particular moment, please switch off your microphones. By the way, it's very interesting. We asked Zoom platform to give us the so-called business Zoom software, but because of new international tensions between different countries, they cannot do it easily. So we have a huge delay with that. So we have to use traditional Zoom, which requires more discipline from the participants. So we would ask again to keep your microphones switched off during the discussions, and you can use chat to ask questions and to approach the seminar manager, our wonderful Katya Minaeva. And again, if you need an interpretation, you can find a special button with the globe, the picture of the globe, and by using this button, you can switch to the required language. Katya, could you give me the second slide? I would like to say a few words about our session today and about observatory. Again, as I mentioned, we as an observatory, we are not going to compete with other seminars online, or we call it the webinars, that we have in different places. Those traditional meetings in online format usually present one important piece of research and discussion, and probably the best and now the most famous series of webinars is conducted by the Center for International Higher Education, led by Professor Simon Marginson at Oxford University. There are also webinars by the World Bank, International Association of Universities, and others. We have a bit different goal. We want leading minds in our field and maybe in other fields to discuss the trends, new phenomena, etc., to have the global intellectual club. And probably for us, who met quite regularly before the pandemic it will be kind of replacement of those great conversations in different cafes, conferences, and pubs. Today with us, Professor Hans David, who represents Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. Professor Simon Marginson, who is the director of the Center for Global Higher Education at University of Oxford, and also one of the leading scholars in higher education studies. And Professor Glen Jones, the Dean of Ontario Institute for Studies and Education of the University of Toronto, which is one of the leading centers of educational research worldwide. I will moderate the discussion of these great minds today. Let me say a few words again about the observatory. Next slide, please. And we, frankly speaking, frankly speaking, no, next slide. The idea of intellectual discussion of and observation emerged quite a long ago between us, but we were very busy with other things and a little bit slowly. We act a little bit slowly, but today and in October, we proudly announced the foundation of the Global Observatory on Transformation of Higher Education that unites intellectual forces from leading centers of higher education studies, include Polytechnico di Milano, University of Toronto, University of Porto, University of Oxford, Peking University, Boston College, University of California, Berkeley, and Institute of Education at HSC University in Moscow. We also are very happy to have joined institutional partners of our group, International Association of Universities and the World Bank. We currently discuss with them how we can work together, and they are very enthusiastic about this development. Next slide, please. Next slide, Dasha. Our mission again is observe, think, and discuss. You know, Charles Darwin, in his famous book, Origin of Species, probably it's in English, I know the Russian title, he started with this famous saying that what scientists do, they collect facts, they observe facts, and they think them through. That's what we have to do, especially when we are becoming witnesses of great transformations. So we want to create a community of researchers that observe things and systematically and share and discuss their observations. Currently, we think about following areas of observation: internationalization of higher education, how organization of universities changed, financing of higher education, students' experience in higher education, the dynamics of higher education systems, and obviously digitalization in higher education. So during 2021, the year 2021, we hope to have expert discussions with, again, leading experts in these fields in this particular area. Next slide, please. And so that was about the observatory, and now we come into the questions for discussion for today. So again, we all agree that 2020 was a year of disruption for the whole world and for higher education as well. So the question, what we think about that? Do we think that there are new systemic trends that have emerged during the pandemic? And what would you highlight as the most striking events and trends in 2020? What were you surprised with? So the next question is about what should we concerned about, what we see as challenges, not just for the status quo, but for the future of higher education in the world. What are changes that we expect in higher education after the pandemic, during the new normality? And we also would like Simon, Hans, and Glen to focus not just on system level, but also to say a few words, probably it's inevitably, on universities level. That's more or less we want to discuss. And again, let me remind you the order of discussion. Each of panelists will have up to 10 minutes to express his views on the topic. Then I hope we'll get questions from the audience, and we'll collect them in the chat, and I and Katya will address that. Or, by the way, panelists are free to take these questions from the chat by themselves. So we'll have 10-15 minutes for questions and answers, and then panelists will be given an opportunity to speak again, to clarify some ideas, some thoughts that they already expressed based on the discussion. And then, if we have time, we'll have more questions and answers. Dear panelists, fellow professors, do you have any questions to me at that moment? Not. Okay. So, Professor Hans David, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you to your institute and to organize this panel discussion about emerging landscapes in higher education. It's always a great pleasure to be with my distinguished colleagues, Simon Marginson and Glen Jones, and you in a discussion about the implications of and transformation of higher education in the global context. Starting with what is most striking, on a personal note, I must say this is exactly 1 year ago that I was in the plane for the last time. So, and that is quite unique, I think, to all of us that has happened. And it's an illustration of how striking the impact has been on the way we in higher education interact with each other. On a personal note, I can also say that's exactly 6 months ago I was with a hairdresser, but that impact has been less greater, and that will be solved on Sunday, I hope. But what I think some of the key points I want to make on what was striking is that, first of all, higher education institutions around the globe have been amazingly responsive to the crisis, that they were closing their campuses, forced to close it, and to move to different forms of learning and teaching using a much more digital kind. And of course, with a lot of problems, loss of quality, dissatisfaction, frustration, depression by students and by faculty. That's all true, but at the same time, we have been able to respond to that. And that is something of an important lesson that also can help us to the future. How can we use digital platforms in a better way as part of our teaching, not as a replacement of our teaching and learning, but as a part of it. Also, besides that, we have been able to transfer our more on-site conferences traveling around the world by using much more this type of communication digitally, webinars, seminars, conferences, in a very effective way to keep the communication, the interaction and debate going on in higher education around the world. So that has been important, and I think we should learn our lessons from that also for the future. Another striking point was that from the global popular perspective, certainly research became a much more important factor in our society. The collaboration on developing vaccines, on finding solutions to the crisis has put research much more on the forefront, and also that creates all kinds of opportunities for higher education to work globally in solving problems around the world. But there are also, of course, serious striking challenges that have been confronted. First of all, there's an increasing inequality in higher education in the world, both at the system level, between systems, especially in the emerging and developing world. The crisis on higher education will have an enormous impact, and the inequality will increase in that, but also between different types of institutions, and also inequality in access and to higher education. The impact will be very striking as well. And
это еще откликнется нам очень сильно.
Financial, academic and other challenges in the years to come as a consequence of this whole pandemic. What has the COVID pandemic learned us as a kind of test of what we didn't know? I think in itself, most of the things that have been coming to the forefront, we
Прежде всего, можно сказать, что очень заметно то, что раньше не происходило. Яснее всего стал тот факт, что до пандемии было много исследований, которые гласили, университеты в любом кризисе
digital will take over and all those kind of things that will happen. But what I see at the same time, in particular at the undergraduate level and in many colleges and institutions, is that we have seen that students, faculty, administrators want not only to learn and have an interaction with the faculty, which can be digital, but want to have a living community of academics and scholars and students. And so the campus life is much more alive than we thought before, and will continue to be that. Students are depressed, faculty are depressed because they have not the possibility in the classroom and outside of the classroom to meet, to interact, to exchange, to debate, etc. So I think this has been, even to a certain extent, a striking experience, that the life of a university and an institution of higher education as a community, as a living community, is much more important than we had thought, and we had put it to the margin. So that I wanted to mention. Of course, that doesn't mean that we should not learn as a solution that the digital can also bring a lot of things to higher education, that we have to learn, as I said before, lessons from the experience with online to improve the quality of learning and teaching, and making use of digital ways of teaching and learning as part of that living community in the campuses. We also probably, hopefully, not always very sure about it, have learned that this whole neoliberalism in higher education has its limitations, has enormous risks. We see that in countries like Australia, etc., where we have been seeing a massive dependence, and also in other countries, on revenues from international students. And now that whole situation is becoming much more risky, and we have to learn from that.
Фактически появились новые риски.
Education which is much more human-centered, much more focused on issues of society and not so much focused on revenue. That's, I think, one important solution that we have to learn from this exercise. Of course, also the need for more global collaboration in both education, research,
образование, в исследования.
do things on our own. We have to collaborate together. It's a very clear oral lesson that we have to learn. And we can use, again, new forms of doing that by making use of our digital platforms, etc., to enhance that. At the same time, as a last remark for this first round, I would say all those solutions are important, but we see important challenges as well. And I think Isaac, in his introduction about Zoom, gave a clear example of that. The geopolitical tensions around the world are a really big danger and challenge for the need for collaboration in a global context. The tensions between Australia and China, the US and China, US and Russia, and Europe and Russia and China, the whole debate about academic freedom, all those issues are very important challenges that we have to overcome. So it's not only the pandemic that we have to learn from, but we also have to address the other challenges that we are facing and will be a high risk. And we have to, as academics and as scholars, to see how we can contribute to overcome those challenges beyond the pandemic. And with that, my first intervention closes, and look forward to the further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, and thanks everyone who switched off the microphones. We had almost no interruption. There are some people in chat who mentioned difficulties with the translation. It's unfortunately the reality of new technologies. There are some difficulties usually. I know that our technical team is trying to solve them. Again, colleagues, if you want to ask the panelists directly, you can write in chat in English. Okay, I have already a lot of questions, Hans, but according to the procedure, I will give the floor to Professor Simon Marginson for the next intervention. Please switch on the microphone. We also have this usual mistake often.
Yeah, thank you, Isaac. And let me begin by saying that I agree with everything that Hans has said. I thought the balances he struck were exactly right, and both the positive and the warning signs that he expressed were the right ones. It's a pleasure to share this screen with Isaac and Hans and Glen, and with what looks like 150 participants. That's a tremendous number, and it's good to see some of our regulars from Center for Global Higher Education are included in that group. So hi to Doria Abdallah in Malaysia and others who have said hello to me in the chat. I want to congratulate HSC. I think that HSC is doing a very good job in maintaining international contact between the large Russian higher education and science system and the rest of the world, and also in encouraging a global discussion in itself. So there are still only a limited number of these kinds of global platforms, and HSC is one of the places where everyone is brought together periodically. And I think this is a very important function in scholarly work and in general in the world. So congratulations, Isaac. Keep doing what you're doing. I think this is an excellent initiative, the observatory. I mean, this says something to me about Russia. You know, there's always a polarity, a kind of tension in Russia between looking inward, vast country, you know, so much to look at when you look inward, like in India or China or US, but also looking outward. Russia has a strong tradition of engagement in Europe and in Asia and in the world, and always Russia moving between these two roles. But I think that, you know, in this period of multipolarity, the rise of Eurasia, which Bruno Macaes, the former Portuguese Minister for Europe, has written a brilliant book called The Dawn of Eurasia, which shows that Russia moves into a more central position geopolitically in the next century, just by the fact that East Asia and India are becoming so important. Europe continues to be important alongside the United States and Canada and the Americas. But Russia is right in the middle of things, geographically speaking, because of the rise of Eurasia. And Russia is a major player, you know, forever. And this is, for the rest of the world, it's very important for us that Russia is open and engaged with us and providing a platform for world discussion. So HSC, I think, embodies the best tradition in that regard. Now, I will quickly move to share my screen because I do have a couple of things there. See if this works. We seem to have a...
Yeah, it works.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I want to point to some tendencies and to try to distinguish between things that are happening because of the pandemic and things in which are happening because of the pandemic and are going to leave a permanent mark. I mean, there's a lot of things which Hans and others have talked about are happening, but only some of them are going to leave a permanent mark. And I think a lot of people have talked about how the pandemic hurries up certain tendencies. And I think that's true in all respects. You see things that might have taken 5 years happening in 12 months and so on. So the things I would emphasize as likely to leave a permanent mark are, firstly, the global differentiation that the pandemic has induced. I mean, some countries and some higher education and science systems are handling the pandemic better than others and are going to come out stronger in comparative terms. Others have been a little bit shaken by the pandemic experience or are being weakened in resource terms and will diminish somewhat. The second thing is, I think, the change to online administration and meetings and teaching and learning will leave a permanent mark to some extent. We'll go back to face-to-face teaching for all of the reasons that Hans has said, which I see every day. People want to be back in the classroom and they appreciate more than before, I think, the role that the faculty play and a faculty and student community plays in learning. Students, above all, perhaps want to see each other. They want to socialize, they want to make friends, they want to learn from each other, they want to share things. They want to grow up together, you know, especially at first degree level, as Hans mentioned. So I think we are going to see the classroom reasserted for sure, but also we'll do more online learning than we did before the pandemic. And most of all, we're going to do much more administration and meetings on the pandemic, and we'll have more international meetings, not less, because of online facility. This kind of discussion will become very normal in our lives, I think, for the long term now, and we weren't doing so much of this before. So, but I think I particularly appreciate the fact that you can get a lot more work done online in some respects than you can face-to-face with administrative matters and so on, committee meetings, that kind of thing. I think all of that becomes much more containable and compressed, but as a result, we end up working harder than before, speeding up, getting more work done, as happened with email before that. So, you know, there's some dangers in that too. But I think, yes, the online world will leave a permanent mark. And the other one, I think, where we're seeing a long-term change is the pandemic period is making very problematical the position of this generation of graduates in getting a job. Going into a recession economy, they face great challenges, and it will leave a scar on this generation of graduates. But I think that's part of a longer-term trend, which is that as we massify, the graduate employment becomes problematized more than before, so that not everyone can go into professional jobs in mass systems, and that's a fact. And as Martin Troe said a long time ago, the the graduate labor moves down the wage and salary structure. It moves down the labor market so that graduates do jobs which non-graduates were doing before. And this trend has been rather exacerbated, I think, by the fact of the graduate employment crisis that is coming out of the pandemic. So we'll see graduate employment and unemployment, underemployment moving to center stage, with governments trying to pin the blame on higher education institutions for the problems that graduates have, but they're problems essentially of the fact that when you take participation from 15% to 50% or more, then you problematize graduate employment. It's no longer all professional employment and so on. But I think graduates are much better off as graduates than they are as non-graduates. They have more agency, they have more capacity. If they can't get a professional job, they're more likely to be entrepreneurially successful on their own behalf, because they have the educated attributes of confidence, communication skills, knowledge that their programs have brought them, and so on. So, I mean, I'm quite sure that massification will not stop. It will continue, but there'll be more debate and more problems around graduate employment. Let's quickly, let me look at the geopolitical trend in relation to the pandemic experience. Now, this table shows you the countries which are the leaders of international education in terms of numbers of international students in 2018. So it begins with US, the biggest component, goes down to Argentina. You see Russia is number 5 in its role as an international educator, very big role with Kazakhstan and other parts of Central Asia, for example. The second column has the number of people who've died as a result of COVID-19 or associated with COVID-19. I think a lot of us feel that's probably, these estimates are a bit low in some countries, because many of the deaths that have occurred because of the pandemic haven't been in fact directly attributed to it. But anyway, you see how uneven the experience has been. East Asia, they successfully managed the pandemic from the beginning. Australia was lucky because it can be isolated as an island continent. It can be cut off by stopping inward flights. And so they've been able to control the pandemic through that mechanism. The continental countries, Europe, Russia, US, and so on, too difficult to close off all inward transport, impossible to fully contain the pandemic, and have had these horrendous death tolls, with some countries having better experience because they managed the pandemic better at the level of social discipline or medical care than others. Then the third column has population, and the fourth column has deaths per 2019 population. Now, I don't think that we're going to see a fundamental change in student mobility, in the sense that the countries with big death tolls are going to see few international students in future. Quite the contrary. I think international mobility will eventually go back to more or less where it was, with the English-speaking countries still playing the largest single role, Russia continuing to play a major role, and so on. But I think that long-term, the East Asian countries and Germany, and the Nordic countries, where the pandemic has been relatively well handled, have come out looking stronger in world terms. There will be something of a geopolitical shift in favor of those two zones, parts of Europe and East Asia, in not only in terms of their economic position and the stability of their governance, but in terms of their role in human society as examples and models and ideas. In all of this, you know, the East Asia especially has, I think, boosted its long-term position in human civilization. Not just China, but also the democracies as well. You know, South Korea and Taiwan have also handled things very, very well in this period, for exactly the same reason as the People's Republic of China, because they are able to manage the role of the state, the role of government in a consensual way, and people are able to work within the framework set by government. They can trust government, and government can give relatively clean, objective, scientifically based advice on what to do. And Japan also shows this, and you know, South Korea also shows this. So all of these Confucian civilizational countries have all shown that their model of governance and their model of social order actually works very well in a crisis. And we're going to see more and more crises coming down the line with climate change especially. So I think the pandemic is sort of, you know, if you like, another nail in the coffin of the idea that the only successful models are European, and the only successful models are especially English-speaking European. I mean, I think that, you know, there are strengths and weaknesses in all societies, and we'll have a more balanced assessment of that in the human story as we go forward, with the strengths of the, you know, the individualist, the high initiative, open, exciting culture of the United States, its strengths being recognized as they are, I think, worldwide, but also the strengths of a East Asia, which is able to manage collective life better, and where the individual is not always held up above everything else as the sole virtue. you know, there's a more balanced relationship between the individual and the collective. So I think, you know, both individualism and the collectivism in different parts of the world are strengths and will be recognized as such. Perhaps out of that, we will develop a more balanced and stable world society, which recognizes these different elements as all equally important. That's certainly my hope as a higher education professor. So I think we will see, you know, the pandemic has been an important watershed in creating a more multipolar and perhaps ideologically more open and culturally more diverse world. In relation to online, I think there's significant support in parts of the world, and I think of India especially, where I've been doing some work recently, for the idea that massification can be made cheaper and easier by doing it through the online process. And this is a little like the panacea of yesterday, which was the private sector as the massifying sector in emerging countries like Brazil and India and Philippines and so on. Now it's online, or maybe it's going to be online and private in future. That'll be seen as the way forward. And I'm sure the tech companies would like that to be the case. But I think what the pandemic has shown us really clearly is how unequal the availability of digital infrastructure and especially devices in the home really is. In India, only about one rural household in 10 has access to the internet. And in India, the rural sector is more than 60% of the population. So the idea that the Indian government can reach its 50% national educational plan target, 50% participation in tertiary education by 2030 through digital rollout is nonsense. I mean, the infrastructure isn't there, the bandwidth isn't there, and most importantly, the facilities aren't there in the home, and they won't be in the home for the foreseeable future. So we know, I think, as a result of the pandemic experience, even in the wealthier countries where the bottom quarter of the population doesn't have proper internet access and doesn't have sufficient devices at home, we now know that this is not the way forward for massification. It's an important adjunct, it's an important part of an education system, but it's not a substitute for bricks and mortar, real institutions with real people teaching and real students in real classrooms. Massification is going to be more expensive in the traditional form, but in the end, it's the only viable way you can bring mass higher education to large numbers of people in a moderately equitable way. So I think, close down there. I mean, the other issues I wanted to draw attention to, and Hans has also mentioned, are the things which I think are more passing, but are really serious problems that have arisen in the pandemic period. I say more passing because I think in the longer term, the domestic politics of most countries will see these issues resolved in a more favorable way. But at the moment anyway, we face serious problems of greater inequity, partly because of access to digital higher education being inadequate, but partly because students who are from poorer families need to work while they're studying, and their labor market has collapsed during this period, and they haven't been provided with student financial support as generous as has been provided in the case of many countries in substitute wages for people who've been laid off during the pandemic. Finance in a number of countries, the countries that are dependent on tuition and dependent on the market, have been destabilized, certainly in their mass institutions, and that is adding to stratification pressures, with the elite institutions surviving fairly well, but the mass institutions being underfunded and struggling for enrollments in some cases. And I think it'll take a while before that financial destabilization is corrected. International mobility, of course, massive change in the short term, great reduction in jobs, and it'll take some time before it returns to where it was. But I'm pretty sure international mobility will bounce back in the form of, you know, the 1 year trip and so on. I think we'll see less short-term traveling in future, but we'll certainly see the same level of the long-term 1 year or more educational travel. And of course, lastly, and to again agree with Hans, collaboration. This has been the big gain in the period, big positive thing. We've seen more international scientific collaboration than ever, despite the geopolitical tensions, which I think are now with us permanently in a more multipolar world. We've seen tremendous scientific commitment to cooperation, and very effective use of open science, posting things on the internet, data being shared immediately, it's available, that kind of thing, very instrumental in the development of vaccines. And I think that what this shows is that we in higher education and science handle the balance between global cooperation and national identity better than our governments do. Our governments are bound in a kind of national container world where they cannot see outside national interests, whereas we move between our national identity and our global cooperation very freely. And I think that's what the human species needs to do. It needs to do that. It needs to be able to move between local and national on one hand, and international cooperation in a world with common problems on the other. And I think maybe universities are the hope of the human race at this point of time, in probably being the developed sector, which is the best at international relations. And the more power I think there is to higher education in our societies, the better in that sense. It gives us some hope of addressing the tremendous challenges that are coming down the line in the next 20, 30 years. Thanks, Isaac.
Thank you very much, Simon. Before I ask Glen to get the floor, I would remind colleagues, I see a couple of questions already in the chat, and I encourage others to add the questions for our speakers and maybe comments. Professor Glen Jones, please.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Isaac and his team for this wonderful opportunity. This whole notion of an observatory has come from the Higher School of Economics, and Isaac and his team have clearly played the leadership role necessary for this, this creation. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to facilitate discussion and conversation globally, and I want to applaud Isaac and his leadership for this. And of course, it's a great to be here with my colleagues Hans and Simon. It's always a challenge to be the third speaker and, following those two, because of course they've said all the intelligent things. But let me try and add to this conversation a little bit. And I think that both Hans and Simon have focused a lot on the kind of international dimension, and perhaps I'll focus a little bit more on a kind of institutional perspective, and that is some of the issues that institutions themselves need to ponder and think about. As I was thinking about this session, I was reminded of Kurt Lewin's old notion back in the 1940s of change management theory, and his notion of the kind of freezing metaphor or unfreezing metaphor in organizational change. And if you remember the idea was if you want to change a block of ice, there's two ways. One is you can chip away at it, but the other is you can find ways to unfreeze the ice and then reshape it organizationally into the kind of organization that you think it should be. And obviously the notion of unfreezing, of destabilizing the institution and then moving forward in a new organizational form kind of underscores the whole concept of change management theory, at least in the versions of it. And I think to some extent we can talk about the notion that we've gone through this unfreezing period. As Simon noted with that wonderful table, clearly the public health responses have been so very different in different countries. We've seen countries where the higher education systems have not had to adjust very much, or if they did, it was for a relatively short period of time. And in some of those situations, they've already returned to something like, at least on the domestic front, a kind of new normal. While others like my own are still very much unfrozen. And it looks like that will be the case for at least another 6 months and maybe longer. And there are systems which will be going through this kind of disruption for a longer period of time because of the challenges in parts of the world in terms of dealing with the pandemic. So given that metaphor and given some of those basic ideas, I want to talk a little bit about two basic questions, and that is, what have we learned from this period of unfreezing? And then the second is, what are some of the key issues that need to be considered in terms of the new shape of higher education, and specifically perhaps at the institutional level? And this would be the notion of the new normal, but I think that phrase has sort of been overused. But what are some of the key issues that need to be considered in terms of the new shape of higher education? So first, what have we learned from the unfreezing? Going back to Hans' point, I think that we've kind of disrupted the narrative about how slow universities can change. The organizational structure of universities has always been one in which at least observers have suggested that these are institutions capable of amazing speed in terms of the change of new knowledge and in terms of being at the forefront of research and innovation. At the same time, there's been this criticism of the university's inability to change in terms of issues of pedagogy, in terms of some of its basic structural arrangements. And what we have learned from this is that that narrative is wrong, and that institutions of higher education are quite capable of changing rapidly when they have to. In some cases, it's been remarkably successful. In others, it has been incredibly challenging and difficult. So there's certainly an institutional perspective here in terms of variation. But the narrative of the sort of slow-moving, incapable of shifting institution, I think, has been thrown out the window in the context of a pandemic, which has required institutions almost overnight to shift both their pedagogy and their business practice. And I think that institutions in many situations have done reasonably well in terms of adjusting to that. The second point I would raise is in terms of what we've learned. I think the pandemic has both illuminated and exacerbated sort of existing and frequent sort of systemic inequities. So some of these are been highlighted, inequities have been highlighted in this arrangement. Some of them are systemic inequities that have been both illuminated and exacerbated because of this. And most of these, I think, are kind of well known now because they've become part of public conversation, that students from low-income populations that relied on service jobs, well, those jobs largely disappeared in the context of the pandemic. The differences in terms of access to home study space and access to technology, what we know about anti-Black and anti-Indigenous systemic racism within our society has been exacerbated both at the system level and within that broader society, and of course, within our own institutions. We have junior faculty with small children working in modest apartments whose experience of this has been, much more dramatically challenging than those who have higher salaries and have children that are not at home anymore and responsibilities have shifted. I think as Simon has noted, it's exacerbated differences between institutions. Of course, there were universities that were financially struggling before the pandemic, and now their situation is much more challenging. And there are institutions that were doing relatively well before the pandemic or excelling. And while they've seen some challenges, there's clearly a kind of stretching of the vertical stratification in some systems, as institutions that were at the bottom end, either in terms of prestige or status or financial stability, have found their situation worsening, and those at the top have been less challenged, and in some cases may actually come out of this in an improved situation because of the circumstances that they're in. Some of this, looking locally in Ontario, which is the Canadian province I'm most familiar with, we've just got application data for this next year, and there's this kind of bifurcation that has occurred. Applications have gone up at the 6 largest, most comprehensive universities, the institutions that have perhaps the highest international status. And all of those institutions have seen increases in application, and they have gone down at all the other institutions in the province. So whether that's a long-time trend, I don't know, but it certainly signals this kind of bifurcation and this increase in stratification within the system. We've also learned new ways of doing things, and this has been alluded to both by Hans and Simon. All of this notion of online teaching, we've learned about the essential role of the assumption we might have made about the essential role of in-person conferences for networking and knowledge mobilization has been thrown out the window as we now participate in online conferences. Notions about office hours and notions of place have been disrupted because we can do these things in different ways. That many of these assumptions about how we work are simply wrong, or at least overstated, and that we've learned that there are new and quite viable ways of doing some of the things that we've always done. I've noted, for example, at least in my own institutions, the student evaluations of teaching have either been roughly the same or actually gone up in the context of COVID. And some of that might be a kind of empathy for the challenges of the instructor, but it certainly suggests that the new environment hasn't, at least from a student perspective, led to a tremendous decrease in the quality of education. I think the challenges our students face are on the financial side and on other sides of the equation. And I think that as Simon noted, the participation, and Hans as well, participation in academic and community events has actually increased. That we're seeing participation in events that are operating online increased dramatically. We had a seminar a week ago with 900 people. I was at a book launch yesterday with 250. These are numbers that we would never have considered 6 months ago, or sorry, a year ago or 2 years ago. And suddenly we're seeing much greater participation and much greater sense of a desire to observe, and a greater opportunity for people to participate in these kind of academic conversations. Most international activities have been destabilized, and that has come through the conversation with both Simon and Hans. We're seeing some increasing applications for international students in some high status institutions, a decrease in others, again, perhaps signaling greater vertical stratification within the system. And of course, in our context, notions of outbound student mobility have largely been paused. So again, the notions of the more mobile and the less mobile countries, I think, again, these differences are probably exacerbated during this period. So without going on, there's been a lot of things I think we have learned in terms of this. So let's turn it around a little bit and talk about what are some of the key issues that need to be considered in terms of this new shape as we think about moving towards this new environment in a post-COVID situation. And let me raise three that I don't think my colleagues have raised. I've tried to sort of adjust things a little bit in response to the wonderful comments that they've made. One, I think, is do we have the higher education leadership needed to further the conversations about the new shape of higher education? I mean, that may sound like a kind of silly question, but I think that the skill sets necessary to manage an institution's return to the old normal are very different than the kind of skill sets and strategy that are necessary to lead universities through the processes that lead to new shapes and changes. And so I think the question of leadership becomes incredibly important in this period. And we often don't talk about that in the context of international higher education. But I think the notion that in order to adjust and take advantage of the opportunities, this unfreezing and freezing process happens, we really do need leaders who can assist in the changing of cultures, who can raise basic assumptions and raise questions about practice, looking at new opportunities. And these require complex leadership abilities that I don't think are as common as we might think. And so I think there are questions about how we lead this movement forward, and that's going to be particularly important at the institutional level. The second is given these systemic inequities we've noted, to what extent will we consider the personal in assessing higher education? And I'm going to start with, to me, the most obvious one is to what extent will we will considering the personal in assessing the academic professional. In institutions, even the top research universities around the world, are giving some thought to the notion of increasing the flexibility associated with standards for tenure and promotion or academic assessments of faculty, even the recognition of the fact that things have slowed down, that people need more time, that there are children at home, that there are responsibilities for elder care that have jumped into the equation. And I think one of the interesting questions is, to what extent will this flexibility continue given what we've learned about systemic inequities, both in terms of our own faculty, and of course, we could extend the same question in terms of how we assess and fund and think about the experience of our students. So to what extent will this learning about systemic inequities in the experiences of our faculty and staff correspond to changes in how we think about notions of standards and notion of assessing professional accomplishments in the period immediately following COVID? And then the third question I would raise, and sort of the final point in this discussion for me, is how important is the university's place? And both Hans and Simon have suggested that we're going to come back to a situation where place becomes even more important, or at least as important as it was before. And I'm not entirely sure that that's true. I think the balance will shift a bit. And it may shift in the context of the stratification of institutions, where it becomes more important in some institutions than others. I think there are parts of the university where the notion of the physical space and the physical presence was different before than it was. In other words, there have always been parts of the university where the positioning of the individual in that physical space is essential because of labs and research facilities and experiential learning. But in the last decade, I think there have been many parts of the university where you could walk down a faculty hallway and find difficulty identifying a single door that's open because individuals are working from home and they have been using that technology for some time. And my sense is that we're moving into a space where that notion of whether the university as place is as important as it is as a workplace will shift over the next little while, that there will be many services that will be available now online, that the notion that you walk into an office and get served in the traditional way may shift as institutions adopt different practices. I agree with the notion of community, and I agree with the notion of place in the context of the undergraduate experience. But I think there's a balance that'll shift here. I think there will be increasing activities online. I think a lot of work practices will shift to home, not all, but quite a number. And I think that will shift the notion of community and who's at the university and at what time. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a question. How important is this notion of the university as place? Certainly the students want to, at least undergraduate students, want to participate in this kind of environment. I think that we're seeing older students revel in the idea that they don't have to commute and they don't have to necessarily be at campus at a specific time in the context of online education. And so this balance may shift over the next few years. And I think this is a really quite fascinating conversation that we'll be going through over the next 3 or 4 years. So let me end with that, and I welcome the conversation to come.
Dear colleagues, we have 23 minutes left, and we have so many questions that I would ask maybe you to look at the chat. Many questions are in English, and you can pick whatever you wish. With the only request, I would like to leave last 5-7 minutes for some concluding remarks. But I will, as a moderator, I want to have a privilege to ask all of you an important, to my mind, questions, because some of you mentioned, in fact, all of you mentioned that in some form, but it looks like that really big, again, not to answer immediately, but maybe together with other questions, I think that one of the most interesting things that you mentioned is that there will be growing what we call vertical differentiation. There will be growing differences between very selective higher education institutions and non-selective. And one of the reasons of that is that selective universities get most motivated students. They get students that can work themselves in this online environment, etc., etc. And non-selective universities have different students. Maybe that is important reason, but again, that's the question that emerged from your presentations. And another interesting thing, and some of colleagues in the chat mentioned that none of you mentioned the threat to the university sector from big tech companies. And if, yes, a couple of days ago, I looked at new social network, fashionable now in Russia. In my mind, it's waste of time, but anyway, called Clubhouse. It's a kind of chat rooms, live-in chat, voice chat. And there was a discussion of high-tech companies representatives, and they told that they will kill most of universities in the next decade because they will provide all courses that now are provided by universities in convenient time, form, etc., etc. And they will do it better than universities. So please take these questions with you, and maybe you already looked at the web chat, at the chat, and please, who would like to start answering the questions? Simon, please go ahead.
Sorry, Hans and Glenn, I think you're probably equally suitable. Quickly, I'll try and get through a few. I won't try and answer them all. In relation to Isaac's questions, yes, stratification tendencies are being advanced in this period. And I think Glenn was right that some top universities will come out of this stronger, and all of them will be relatively unaffected, whereas most of the rest of the sector will struggle in most countries, not all. I think in some countries, the sector is well protected across the board, but in most of them, the mass institutions are the ones that are really feeling the heat of the effects on resources. So I think that we'll see eventually some kind of reckoning in relation to stratification in more and more countries. So a feeling that it's going too far. The value is being concentrated in a small number of research teaching institutions with high prestige, and emptying out value everywhere else. And that in the long run is hurting the graduate employability of most graduates. Now, exactly what that will lead to, I'm not sure. I'm thinking now 10, 15 years down the track, I'm beginning to wonder about whether we should continue our support for the consolidated research and teaching, the Clark Kerr Multiversity Institution, because I mean, it's certainly the institution that I love and I've grown up in and always worked in. And I love the fact that research and teaching are joined together in the Humboldtian way, but it concentrates so much prestige power at the top, and that becomes then visited on the teaching and education function, so that you have a small number of graduates with highly valued degrees and others with less valued degrees. I think maybe the German, French, Russian traditional model of taking most of the major scientific activity out of the universities and putting them in separate research agencies, with some teaching back into the universities and a lot of links and so on between the faculty in the universities and the faculty in the research agencies. Maybe that model is better because it diminishes to some extent the sharp end of stratification. The world-class university movement has been tremendous for building higher education around the world, but it's building it at the top and not necessarily at the lower levels very well. And, you know, the middle level and the lower levels are really, really important too. They're as important as the top. So I think we'll have to keep an active eye on stratification. On the question of the tech companies and their claim, I'm inclined to think that the new paradigm, which is going to sweep it all away and reconstruct us as a tech-based sector, hasn't come forward yet. I mean, we haven't seen the kind of transformation potential that you've got in, say, journalism or publishing, you know, where it'll never be the same again. It's now predominantly going to be online and so on. But there's no sign of any tech-based platform which can reproduce the prestige benefits and the social networking benefits and the social cultural benefits that the face-to-face bricks and mortar university can provide. I'm not saying it can't happen. You never know, and tech is amazingly inventive, and I'm sure hundreds of people are working on this very problem, trying to develop a prototype which will sweep away the existing university. But I don't think we've seen any sign of that happening just yet. Now, very quickly on some of the other questions. Is technology the thing that sorts institutions in the market? I would say necessary but not sufficient. Everyone's got to be good at online now. Everyone's got to have good platforms and good interactive technologies, but that's not enough in itself to gain a great advantage, and you need more than that. How can we contribute to geopolitical tensions? Well, I think they're here to stay. We've got a world of multipolar power now. It's no longer completely dominated by the United States or the United States and Russia, who formerly used to divide it up between them. We've now got not only US, China, Russia, Europe, a stronger player than it was 20 years ago. But you've also got rising Brazil, rising Iran, India. Don't forget India, a very large country and with a lot of research coming out already. And a lot of, and Japan, and a lot of countries a bit below that, you know, that are going to exert increasing influence as well. So I think we're in a multipolar environment, and where the decolonial movement also will become increasingly potent in shaping emerging national spaces. So you're going to see a situation where everything will move towards greater diversity, greater fragmentation, perhaps at the world level. And so tensions and conflicts of an intercultural and interpolitical kind are going to be more rather than less prevalent in the future. What we can do is provide a space in which people come together. We can keep all of the doorways open. We can encourage cooperation rather than conflict and competition. We can recognize each other's languages and cultures as really important. We can make sure our students are learning multiple languages and learning about other cultures. And we can encourage that through mobility of all kinds, including virtual mobility. So I think we can be a great force for keeping the world together. And there's probably no other force could be as effective as higher education and research in doing that. So we've got a great role in mitigating geopolitical tensions, which are with us, as I said, I think, for the foreseeable future. Public and private, Oleg's question. It depends what kind of public sector you've got. If it's a system where you've got government-supported public sector and you've got a market-based private sector, then the market-based private sector is suffering in the pandemic period in a way that the government-supported public sector is not. Government-supported public sectors are pretty stable and the public good model is looking strong at the moment in those countries that pursue it. If you're in a country where, as in Russia or in Australia perhaps, where the public sector is marketized itself alongside the private sector, then you see a much more similar experience across the two of them. But I think it's a case-by-case problem. You've got to look at each nation as somewhat different in this regard. They've all got different configurations. Doctoral education, loss of the rich community. It becomes too individual, too isolated, doesn't it? Loss of opportunities for field work, loss of opportunities to go abroad for conferences. So a diminished experience for doctoral students, and in some cases, mental health problems that are exacerbated by that isolation. So as with all students, but perhaps more so because of the problem of isolation that always dogs doctoral education, I think there are serious issues in doctoral education, and at my university, we're addressing them on a case-by-case basis. I should stop there. Thanks, Tisek.
Thanks, Hans. I see your willingness. You have 5 minutes, not more, for the answers. It's great to have so many questions.
Yeah, it's great. And I also already see quite some interesting discussions emerging from the chats and our responses to that. I mean, would be very interesting, for instance, to have that debate, but Glen had some disagreement, but I think it's about the university as a place would be a very important topic to further elaborate on in the future. The other one is the debate that Simon addressed about research agencies separating from the universities. Pros and cons to that would be very interesting debate. I mean, I'm inclined to disagree on him with that, but that's what makes research so interesting, to have the kind of debates about what is possible or not. Another one, doctoral education. Doctoral education indeed is, as a result of the pandemic, very much in danger, because you see that many doctoral students struggle with their PhD and the time they have to do and the supervision, etc. But also we see already that universities in their financial constraints are cutting. In the United States, there are several examples. The universities have stopped providing scholarships for doctoral education. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's a bad thing, but at the same time, we should use the momentum to what was already needed before the COVID to really have a substantive debate about the future of doctoral education. Is it the way it is going now? Well, how do we address the much more need for professional doctorates and other forms of doctorate? How do we see the diversity in doctoral education? A very important topic, I think, for also transformation, to see how we can address that. Geopolitical tensions. Simon already said that as well. I think, of course, it's very difficult for institutions to influence that. They have to, but the most important is we have to keep our communication with our colleagues around the world open. We cannot have that we don't interact and collaborate with our Chinese and Russian colleagues from the West. That would be very dangerous. We cannot have that Chinese students who are studying in the US or the UK or Canada are considered on the one hand by the receiving country as being spies, and by their own country as being also dangerous because they have been influenced by us. Well, we have to give them the platform and the possibility to interact in a much more academic free way. So we have to be the place where it is possible to have global interaction and collaboration. Public and private, indeed, as Simon said, you cannot generalize that, because there are public systems which are very much privatized, and there are private systems which have a very strong public influence. What in general is, of course, that higher education around the world will face very financial challenges, and so both the public and the private sector, but the private sector probably more in particular in the emerging and developing world, where the private sector is so strong as a kind of presence, but at the same time will face the fact that many students cannot pay the tuition fees for the private sector, where the public sector has more possibilities to absorb that, although with the danger of the quality. So it's not that black and white to address a clear common answer to that, because context is very important to keep in mind. Very last point, also as a kind of discussion, Simon is in his presentation was very optimistic still that in 5 years' time, the English-speaking countries, the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, will recover in international students. I'm less optimistic about that. I think there will be a much more shift going on, and you see already that many institutions and also national governments are challenging that. I have a blog in University World News on that topic, but I think there will be a shift going away from the English-speaking countries. They will still, of course, keep international students, but the risk that they face, they have to challenge that. In Australia, we have one Canadian institution which already has been closing down because of the fact they were too optimistic about international students as a result of the pandemic. We see it in the US, so there's a lot of challenges there. That's for the moment where I stop.
Thank you very much. It's particularly interesting when our panelists start to disagree with each other, and it's very helpful. Glen, you made a few very provocative statements which really helped to fuel the discussion. Your closing answers, we have 8 minutes left for this webinar. Yeah,
well, let me just speak for 3 minutes and give you some space. A number of the questions in the chat are about technology and about the relationship within technology and education. And I think it's important to recognize that, you know, technology is not new to us, and it's not new to higher education systems, and that 20 years ago we went through the .com elements where there was a whole notion of how technology would be disruptive and everything would change. And the reality is that there are private firms which are experts and have wonderful advances in technology, but we are the content experts. And I think it's the notion of how to use content in this environment. Technology is a wonderful tool, but it's really only a tool unless it's in the right hands. So I think there's, I don't think that technology is a panacea, and I think that you know, there are still MOOCs, and they will continue to grow. There are institutions which have always had online programs for 30 years. There are institutions that survive only on online programs, and that's not going to change. I think if you go back to Martin Troe and Simon had raised the name, he wrote another very interesting article where essentially he used that same notion of elite, mass, and universal to talk about technology. And he suggested that, and which I think is perfectly true, that elite institutions have always had technology, but they've used it for elite purposes. So if you look at one of the top research universities and you look at their faculty of medicine, you'll see incredible technology used in the context of simulation, in the context of how they educate their students. But it's designed essentially to increase the educational experience, not to, and so it's about using technology to make the educational experience better. And I think that pattern will work its way through the elite research universities. In other words, they will be looking at technology and the balance of the use of technology in the context of really increasing the quality of the educational experience where it's possible. At the other end of the continuum, the technology has always been used to increase access. So you've got this elite version of technology, but you also have this universal version of technology. And again, we'll see this exacerbation of vertical stratification, I think, because I think that institutions which are what Simon might call the artisanal institutions on the elite side will continue to use technology, and they'll do it to better their mission and their objectives. And those who are the sort of demand absorbing institutions, at the lower end of the continuum, will use technology both because of its possibilities in terms of efficiency, but also because of its ability to increase access for the populations it's trying to serve. And so I think those are split missions in terms of how we think about technology in universities.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much. We're about to close the seminar, and it's my mistake that I didn't mention specifically that the duration of our seminars will be 80 minutes, and there is a new digital communication etiquette which prohibits us to continue to expand the limits that have been agreed. I just want to thank our three colleagues, because we didn't expect the firm answers. It's very difficult to give answers about the future. And we are talking about the future. We are talking about emerging trends, but things are happening very quickly. So we, in the observatory, are going to continue our observations, to continue our discussions. You will get probably now in chat the web address of the observatory website, which is not very active now, but it will be the place where you will find recordings of our discussions, and we'll produce short briefs after each discussion. So we'll try to get in a few weeks not no more than a couple of pages of the main points. And then in 1 year, we can look at these points and find out, was Glen right about new ways of flexible employment in academia, which sounds very interesting. And for me, as an administrator, really important, critical. Or we'll find what happened with international students or with differentiation. So, dear colleagues, let's continue to observe and think. That's probably the most important things during this very rapidly changing, within this rapidly changing environment. Again, thanks everyone for participation. Thanks audience for the great questions, and obviously thanks to Professors Hans de Wit, Simon Marginson, and Glen Jones for their participation and their thoughts. See you in a few weeks. We'll have a webinar, what happened with higher education finance, with the participation of great educational economists around the world. See you